May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Persistence in prayer. Persistence in prayer. On Monday, I was driving along coming up the M37 heading toward Grant. And I passed by a house with a curious lawn decoration. There was a pile of 3 large rocks, small boulders really, resting on a bed of small river stones, which kind of made up a circle. The bed of the river stones reminded me of all that happens in our lives. We go through our lives and so many different things happen. And it's like the river stones get all polished. Our life gets polished stone by stone as we go. The pile of rocks was reminiscent of 3 very important ideas. These boulders, something to stick up from the middle. The bottom rock is like the foundation stone that we hear about. It represents God. God is the foundation of our lives. Each week we talk about God and we come together to worship God. Last week we heard about 10 lepers and how only one returned to thank Jesus for having cured them. If we had heard the alternate first lesson for last week, we would have heard the story of Naaman, who was a military leader and had leprosy and was sent to the king of Israel to try to find a cure. The king couldn't help. But Elisha, the prophet, could, and he did. When Naaman followed what Elisha told him to do, he was cured. And then he returned not only to thank Elisha, but to proclaim that there is a God in Israel. And this God is the only true God in the whole world. So God is the foundation stone of our lives. That largest stone that was sitting on the bottom of the pile of 3. 2 weeks ago, we talked about another one of the stones. It's the one called faith. And it's the last thing that's mentioned in today's gospel. And I said that a simple explanation of faith is trust. We trust that there will be tomorrow. We trust that God has a plan for our world. We trust that God's plan for the world is good. And we trust that even when we get in the way and make a mess out of God's plan, that God will somehow see us through and lead us in the right direction. We trust that there is birth. We trust that there is life. We trust that there is death. And we also trust that there is resurrection and more life. We have faith, which is represented by that second stone. Today we hear about the 3rd stone. We hear about prayer. The gospel lesson begins with Jesus telling his disciples about the need to pray always. The need for persistence in prayer. Not to give up, not to lose heart. The parable Jesus tells is most often called the parable of the unjust judge. A widow, a woman with no legal rights under the Jewish law, seeks justice. She's a person who doesn't even have the right to approach the judge. This widow seeks justice from the only person in a position to give that justice. And the judge, having no regard for the plight of the widow, no regard for God, no regard for people, this selfish judge just dismisses the widow, tells her to go on home. Today's gospel could also be called the parable of the pushy, nagging widow. This widow, this person who has no rights under the law, this widow comes to the judge and insists that he give her justice. She did not begin her quest by saying, "Oh, noble, just sir, may I humbly ask you for your favor?" No, she simply blurted out, "Vindicate me! Grant me justice against my opponent." This nagging, pushing widow continues to come to the judge. No is not an answer that she will accept. She comes again. She comes again, and again, and again, and again. And she finally wears him down. One day the judge does as she asks, just to keep her from coming back yet another time. Then Jesus asks, will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? In like manner, will not God answer our prayers when we come to him and persevere? In my reading this week, I was reminded that there is more than just one point of view for any subject. That's why I pointed out the two possible titles for this parable. For the judge, he was being asked to recognize before the law a person who had no rights under the law. A woman only gained rights through a husband or maybe a father or perhaps even a brother might do. But this woman had no male at all, so she had no rights. For a judge to arbitrarily recognize her as having a case before the law would be to set a precedent that he might not want to set. It would be to go against the normal teachings of the law of Moses. So the judge has a good point in not wanting to recognize her request. There might be many more widows out there who also would like to have some justice against their opponents. If he grants it to one, then he's got to grant it to all. On the other hand, the widow has no one to be an advocate for her. She has nothing but her own tenacity, her own forcefulness, her own persistence in trying to right what she believes is a wrong. Whatever it was the woman feels is unjust, she does not give up. She believes it too strongly. She cannot let it go until justice is served. In our lives, as we prepare for prayer over some issue or other, can we see both sides of the dispute? Have you ever tried to do that? It's not always easy. How about in the war in the Ukraine? I'm sure that we can see the side of the Ukrainians getting beat up. Can we see the side of Putin and his troops? There's a story attributed to Rabbi Baal Shem Khan. It said that he was standing on top of a hill with a group of his students when he saw a band of Cossacks attack the city below and begin massacring the people. Seeing many of his friends dying and begging for mercy, the rabbi cried out, "Oh, if I were only God!" You might say, "Oh, if it was only a policeman here to catch this person that's doing this thing." A shocked student of the rabbi's turned to him and said, "Master, how can you utter such a blasphemy? Do you mean that if you were God, you would act differently? Do you mean that you think that God is doing the wrong thing?" The rabbi turned and looked the student straight in the eye and said, "God is always right. But if I were God, I would be able to understand why this is happening." In other words, be able to see the other side of it. As we prepare for prayer, as our prayers form on our lips, can we imagine the prayers of our opponents, those who might not think the same way as we do? There was a point in my life where I was just about captured by the Red Army Brigade in Italy. And I could pray saying, "Oh, I don't want to be caught, Lord. Protect me from this." But on the other hand, I would imagine the other side would say, "Oh, let us get this guy. Help us do this." The biblical scholar William Barclay tells the story of a faithful servant girl. It comes from the days when a domestic servant was expected to work all day, and that really meant part of the night as well. The young woman said that because of her work, she had very little time to practice her faith between Sunday to Sunday. So she said that she used to take the used morning newspaper to bed with her at night. She turned to the family notice columns and read the birth notices. She prayed for the babies that had just come into the world. Then she turned to the marriages column and she prayed for true happiness for the couples just mentioned that they were married. Then she finally turned to the death notices and prayed for God's comfort for all who mourned or all who were sad. No one will ever know what blessings came from the attic bedroom from that one person who prayed, but I'm sure they did. That young woman had so little time of her own, but what she had, she spent praying for the needs of others. It didn't matter to her that she didn't know them. It didn't matter that cynics would criticize her for the effort. It didn't matter to her that she was denying herself time for herself in a hard-pressed circumstance. She just did it because she knew it was an outworking of her Lord's compassion and care. It was her need to pray always and not to lose heart, even if she didn't know the people. I read recently that it is not the purpose of prayer to put a headlock on the Almighty, forcing the divine to cry uncle and give us what we want. Prayer is not a mud wrestling match, yet it is not high tea either. Prayer is like a dance between opportunity and surrender, of missing the mark and hitting the mark, of selfishness and selflessness. The bottom line is the only way we can err in prayer is if we do not pray. The only way we can err in prayer is if we do not pray. The persistence in prayer that Jesus calls us to is not a way of wearing down God's indifference or unwillingness to help us. Rather, the aim of true prayer is to wear down the unjust judge within ourselves, so that in us, in those we love, whatever is wrong may be made right by the grace of God. And my friends, the truth is with us as we consider this pile of three props. We consider this pile of God, faith, and prayer. And all the things are made right by the grace of God. That grace can help us understand. So let us always remember to pray always. Never lose heart. Amen. I think my battery